Hi everyone, welcome to the Panhandle Research and Technology Tour Plus, hosted by the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. This event was recorded on December 3rd, 2020.
Start here with this section with Nevin Lawrence, our weed specialist, and he's going to be talking some more about the old Palmer amaranth. So take it off, Nevin.
I'm Nevin Lawrence, weed scientist at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center, and I'll be giving a presentation on controlling Palmer amaranth in dry edible beans without reflex. And this is some work I've been doing with my former grad student Clint Byerman and current grad student Joshua Miranda. So why do I keep talking about Palmer amaranth? Well, there's two main weeds that are commonly resistant to herbicides in the Panhandle of Nebraska, and that's Palmer amaranth and kochia. Both of them are pretty big deals, but kochia doesn't really line up well with when dry beans are planted. So kochia tends to germinate before dry beans go in the ground, giving us some opportunities early in the season to control it. And it's just not that much of an issue in the dry edible beans. Palmer amaranth, on the other hand, is a late emerging weed and tends to correlate well with when dry beans are actively growing and can be very competitive. And just to kind of give some perspective on how bad Palmer can get, this is a photo of just an edge of some research plots I had. Basically, we had good weed control within the research plots, and this is corn, obviously, but you know, the last 3 or 4 feet on the edge of the field, we didn't get that sprayed, and we had quite a bit of Palmer growing up. So we see here corn that's probably 5-6 feet tall and Palmer amaranth that's a couple feet taller. So large weeds, a lot of seeds are produced. But even when you do have good weed control, so this is a picture from one of the plots where we had absolutely no Palmer all season long, and as we get toward the end of the season, the leaves start drying down in the corn, canopy starts to open up a little bit as the corn's desiccating, and we have some sunlight come in, and we have another flush of Palmer late in the season. And that's what this weed can do, is from the time of planting all the way to harvest, you have to worry about new flushes coming up and seeds being produced. One of the my favorite papers I've read on Palmer amaranth is a study in cottonseed lint where they took glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth and they spread a known amount in a field that previously had no glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth, and that's the picture on the left. And then they just sprayed glyphosate, didn't do anything to control those weeds, and then they went and harvested the cotton. And the picture on the right shows how much seed has been found in the soil in the field the next year. So that's just how bad that seed gets spread from year to year. And the title of this paper is In-Field Movement of Glyphosate-Resistant Palmer Amaranth and Its Impact on Cotton Lint Yield. And then subtitled, Evidence Supporting a Zero Threshold Strategy. So in some parts of the country, the risk of Palmer amaranth is so great that they're actually advocating for controlling every single plant. Even just one surviving is a big enough threat to your yield and subsequent crop production that you can't let it get out of there. So controlling it's pretty important. That being said, we don't really have a lot of options in the Panhandle of Nebraska. If you're growing corn on corn, there's quite a bit you can do and quite a bit of herbicides available. When you move into corn before dry beans though, atrazine's out, most Group 27 herbicides are out, and we move into corn before sugar beets. Well, now we've lost even more options. We're left the Group 15s, the Group 4s, the synthetic auxins, and 2 of the Group 14 Sharpen and Valor. With dry edible beans, usually when we talk about resistant Palmer amaranth, we're talking about glyphosate resistant, which isn't too much of an issue in dry edible beans, but also ALS resistant. So Raptor, Pursuit, Varisto, those don't really work that well. And Basigram isn't very effective on it. So the only post-applied herbicide we have left in dry beans that works is Reflex. And Reflex works great, and our research has shown that. Very effective on dry edible bean, except for Reflex does have some limitations. If you can't get it applied on time, there's a pretty strict rotation interval to corn, which will prevent you from using it. So you have to be timely in this application. If your crop rotation is too restrictive, you can't apply it. If you gravity irrigate, you can't apply it. And in 2021, I've been told that they're going to move from a 10-month restriction to corn to an 18-month, and that's going to really prevent the majority of our growers from using it. So the only post-emergence option we have, Reflex, is no longer going to be usable for most of our growers. So what do we do without Reflex? So in 2019, we did a study looking at using Outlook in a split program. So we applied Outlook and Prowl pre-emergence, and then we were trying to put Outlook on post-emergence before the pre-application broke. And the idea is you overlap the pre and post herbicides to always have some residual herbicide in the ground that's going to control any Palmer amaranth that's opening up. And the important thing here to look at is we used a bunch of different applications. So treatment 2 and treatment 5 both contain reflex. Those are going to work pretty well. And then treatments 3, 4, 6, and 7 all had Outlook in it, pre-emergent or post-emergent. So the Outlook was either applied at V1 or first trifoliate or V3, the third trifoliate. And what we found is everything that we applied worked really well except for that Outlook applied at the third trifoliate. So by waiting to apply Outlook at the third trifoliate, we had a window where the Palmer amaranth could emerge, and it did. However, when we applied it at the first trifoliate, which was the treatment 3, we were able to get season-long weed control. This is simply the density of plants. We did have some plants in there, quite a bit of variation between plots, but you can see a pretty similar amount of Palmer amaranth between treatments 2 through 5 and 7 compared to 6. So only when Outlook was applied at the third trifoliate were we seeing this escape. Going into these photos here, so July 22nd in 2019. The treatments really to pay attention to here are treatment 3 and treatment 6. And treatment 3, once again, was Outlook at V1 or first trifoliate, and it's pretty clean. And July 22nd, then also at August 6th, same thing, no Palmer amaranth emerging. But if you look at treatment 6, where it's the same treatment, Outlook post alone at the third trifoliate, we have some Palmer coming in July 22nd, and by August 6th, that's a pretty messy plot. So we are seeing season-long weed control with just using Outlook post, but the ability of that treatment to work really depends on timing. So one thing to keep in mind here is our population at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center of Palmer amaranth is not entirely resistant to Raptor Basigram. So depending on where we're at in the field, we can see that treatment really fail, or it can do pretty well. So sometimes we actually get pretty good control with just Raptor Basigram alone. Sometimes we don't, just depends on where we're at in the field. And so this picture on the right is showing that we're having pretty good weed control. There's a couple Palmer amaranth plants emerging with that Raptor Basigram post, but the resistance isn't too high. Looking over here though, when we look at just Outlook alone as a post-applied herbicide, so this is similar to the study in 2019, except for this is 2020, we see a completely clean plot from that V1 application, that first trifoliate of Outlook alone. But we're also seeing a completely clean plot from that third trifoliate. So looks a little bit different than we saw in 2019. And what this is telling us is that Palmer amaranth emergence timing can vary quite a bit from year to year. So 2020, that third trifoliate application didn't really work. We had an escape between the pre-application and that third trifoliate application, but in 2020, that worked really well. We had greater activity, longer longevity of that pre or applied herbicide. So things do vary, but the important thing from this is regardless of the year, that first trifoliate application of Outlook seemed to really do the job. The other thing that we looked at is right now, Outlook is the only group 15 herbicide that's labeled post in dry edible beans, but there's anticipation that both Dual Magnum and Zidua are also going to be labeled pretty soon. So the photo on the left here is Dual plus Prowl followed by Dual first trifoliate. This is just a crop safety study. And what we found is that the Dual had excellent crop safety and that we were able to get pretty good weed control. Zidua also provided good weed control, but really smoked the dry beans. And so we saw quite a bit of injury from that pre-application of Zidua. But that's not a reason to stay away from Zidua. Under the anticipated label, what's going to happen is that Zidua is not going to be labeled in dry beans for pre-application. It's going to be labeled for a post-application. And likely you do a program such as Outlook and Prowl pre, followed by Zidua post. When we applied the Zidua in that sort of system, so the photo on the left is a third trifoliate, photo on the right is a fifth trifoliate, we're seeing excellent crop safety. So In the future, we do anticipate to have some expanded labels allowing dual magnum to be applied post, not just outlooks. That's going to give growers a few more options, and also Zidua as well as being applied as a post-emergent option. And what the benefit of this is, besides just giving growers more options, is right now Outlook is limited to a pre-application and one post. And so you can apply Outlook pre-emergence, you can apply it at one-time post, and then you're done. If we had expanded labels of both dual magnum and Zidua, we would have an opportunity then to potentially do 2 applications post of a group 15 to really get that whole season-long weed control if we're under very heavy Palmer amaranth pressure. However, in our research, we are seeing that one shot at the first trifoliate generally leads to season-long weed control. There may be situations where you'd want to have those 2 shots of Outlook. The other issue that we investigated this year, or quite a few on Palmer amaranth control, is looking at whether or not cover crops can help suppress Palmer amaranth in dry beans. And the picture on the left is basically just a pre-emergent herbicide. That's all we did. We didn't put any post out. And the picture on the right is pre-emergent herbicide only as well, but in this case we had a cover crop. You can see some of the wheat straw in there, and we are seeing some suppression. So we got to figure out the timings of removal and timing for planting, especially following a corn crop. But we are seeing some potential for cover crops to help with Palmer amaranth control in dry edible beans. Other program we have going on is looking at when Palmer amaranth emerges in dry edible bean. This is going to help time post applications. And the picture on the left is simply when we removed weeds and what the weed species composition was. And so we're seeing the Palmer amaranth isn't very present in the weed populations until about that R2 to R5 timing, which kind of we can backtrack then and look at when they may have merged. But we are seeing that it's far more common in those later removal timings compared to the earlier timings. And then we're trying to time that removal, or when we put a post application out, to how that's impacting dry edible bean yield. We have some good data from 2018. 2019, unfortunately, we had 3 hail storms in 10 days and lost our yield data. But in 2020, this year, we were able to get some pretty good yield, and we should have some further information on that. And then lastly, we are also looking at how Palmer amaranth impacts dry edible yield. This picture on the left here is not actually dry edible beans. We're doing a similar project in sugar beets, but this is just showing how many plants per meter row or yard row of Palmer amaranth you need. And in sugar beets, at least 1 year, one plant every 2 yards of row on 22-inch rows was able to lead to an 84% yield loss in sugar beets. And so we're trying to see if we have a similar amount of yield loss observed in dry edible beans, or what the anticipation is for a dry edible bean grower if they are having some weed escapes with Palmer amaranth. And we are also tying that down to seed production as well. So we can say if you had 1 plant per meter row, you can anticipate around 150,000 seeds per acre being produced. And that's a high number, but that's just how many seeds they actually produce. And we'll be looking in that in the future as well. Thanks for watching the presentation, and I'm sticking around for any questions you may have, or you can contact me by calling the Panhandle Research and Extension Center if you have further questions, or email me at nlawrence2@unl.edu. And I don't have Twitter, so you can't get me there.
Okay. Any questions for Nevin? I don't see. Wait, there's one in the chat. Oh, nope. Anybody have any questions? Well, I guess I'll just start it out, Nevin. I guess the first thing I'm interested in is kind of what about the history of Palmer? Where did it come from, and why did it emerge now, or relatively new as a pest?
Sure. So Palmer amaranth is actually native to the United States. It's from northern Mexico and then the American Southwest, so Arizona, New Mexico, I think parts of Texas, and and we have a few species actually of Amaranthus that are native to the United States, but it kind of started being a problem, I think, in Texas first in well, it was present in cotton, but it wasn't too much of a problem, and it just sort of spread and was a background weed. And they used to call it, before it was Palmer amaranth, they called it, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was something like lazy weed or something like that. And the reason for that name was it was only the lazy farmers that had it. So it was pretty easy to control if you're doing the tillage the right way. And so it's always kind of been a background weed in sort of the southern cotton belt, but not too much of an issue. And then glyphosate came out, and the cotton went to no-till, and a lot of that area would be doing a rotation where they might be doing cotton followed by soybeans, and they would be using glyphosate in both crops. And once resistance started to that, it really started to take off, and they'd switch to another mode of action and it'd become resistant to that. And that cotton lint, they remove the seeds from it. That seed becomes cattle feed. The cows eat the seed. It passes the digestive system, still being able to germinate. That gets spread out as manure onto some farmers' cornfield, and then away we go. And so that's the thought of where it came from. The resistance we have in the Panhandle, the multiple resistances we have, it's likely that those are didn't originate here, so we didn't have glyphosate resistance start in the Panhandle. It's just that some resistant seed came from somewhere else, and so it's been moving pretty rapidly from the Cotton Belt to new areas. And I think early to mid 2010s or late, I think 2000s is when we first had it in the Panhandle, and it's pretty new here. It's pretty new to the North Dakota. It's new to Michigan. It's new to Minnesota. So it's really starting to expand north into areas that didn't previously be present in. I think you're actually seeing it in Canada now too.
Okay, well that's we also, because of the limitations that you were discussing as well, we potential train wrecks coming on with this particular problem. And I think I know the answer, but do you see anything on the horizon to bringing out another or several new herbicides that might be able to control it better?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's and I hope there's no one here in the sugar beet industry in the seed production world, but I've been joking that the last since I've started in 2016, the next 4 years, we're going to have triple stack sugar beets, and that's always the next year. It's still 4 years away, but that will be coming, I think, within the next probably 4 to 6 years, and that's going to be Liberty Link, dicamba, and glyphosate resistant sugar beets, and that's going to be a pretty that's going to definitely help our growers here. It's going to give us a lot more options for controlling the Palmer amaranth, but at the same time there are some limitations. We are seeing Liberty doesn't work as well in the western US because of how dry it is compared to other parts of the country. We're already seeing group 4, which dicamba is group 4 herbicide resistance in other parts of the country. So it's not unheard of that we could have that same resistance here as well. And so we're just kind of pushing the path back a little bit more. But I've got another question here. I'm going to look through from Matthew Schmidt about, do we anticipate Zidua to be approved for use in dryable beans post-emergence? Yes. So as I said in my presentation, we looked at it as a split application similar to how Outlook's used, and we saw quite a bit of injury. However, what BASF is planning on doing is having, I believe, a Section 18 label. So that's an emergency use label for parts of Colorado and the Panhandle of Nebraska, where it would only be labeled post-emergence. I anticipate they're probably going to be going for a third or fifth trifoliate application. I would like to see that as a first trifoliate, but they are worried about crop injury from it. From our research, we're only seeing any injury from a pre-application. Post-application, it seems really safe. And so I think as soon as they get that approved, they're going to be getting that labeled.
Just, I guess, from us non-weed scientists, could you just briefly go through and talk about those groups? You mentioned group 14 and group 15. How would they differ, and you know, what's the mode of action, that sort of thing?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. Basically, when you know, there's dozens of different modes of action between them. The group 4s are synthetic auxins, and the reason we like to talk about that is a lot of resistances, when we get resistance, especially ALS resistance, that's pursuit and raptor, things like that. You can have resistance to one herbicide and you're resistant to the whole class of herbicides. And so when we talk about using multiple herbicides in a program, we would like to see producers try to use different classes. And so although you can have resistance to an ALS inhibitors, it's likely not going to also cause resistance to another mode of action. So that's how we prefer to talk to it. But there's quite a bit of difference. The group 2 and group 9, which is the ALS inhibiting and glyphosate, both those inhibit synthetic auxins, and so it kind of this very slow death of the plant as it's sort of starved for resources. You have other herbicides which are light interfering, so they inhibit the ability of plants to photosynthesize. You have other ones that prevent the plant from growing new cells. You have other ones which just do kind of crazy things to the plant. The group 4s are probably the most spectacular to watch. That's the dicamba 2,4-D, and it caused the plant to twist up and swell and do all sorts of things. And that inhibits an auxin, which tells the plant basically where to grow. And so it's just saturating that plant with a bunch of hormones saying grow everywhere at the same time, and causes a lot of weird things to happen. That's probably one of my favorite parts of my job, actually, is spraying a bunch of weird chemicals on plants and watching them die. It's quite rewarding.
Well, is it like with the disease stuff? You know, it's a good idea to use different products that have different modes of action, and they're different chemistries. And so I assume you would do the same thing, or else you end up with the glyphosate resistance, right?
Yeah, and that's
other chemicals in there with it.
Yeah, and that's I like to talk about something called I call the herbicide resistance treadmill, where in the past, you know, we'd have resistance to, let's say, atrazine, and so then you'd switch over to using a group 2 herbicide or something like Raptor, and then you get resistance to that, and so then you switch to glyphosate, and resistance to that occurs. And so if you're always just, you know, using one herbicide to control the weed, it's only a matter of time before that resistance happens as well. And so what we're trying to advocate is using several modes of action at the same time to control the weed. That way it's unlikely you'll have resistance start to both. But that's also basically, we're telling farmers, if you don't want resistance, just spray more herbicides, which costs more money. And that's not always a practical solution, because they have to make money too doing it. And so it's a tricky problem of how to limit the resistance. And that's where things like crop rotation and cover crops come in, is we can sort of take some of the pressure off those herbicides.
Okay. Is there any other questions? Because I have one more that sort of focuses in on what Nevin just mentioned. Is it that with the cover crops? You were using wheat, right, in that particular situation, but does it matter what type of crop you would use for a cover crop? Other cereals, or is there other things to use?
Yeah, it certainly does matter what you use for a cover crop. I think I'm not someone that studies soil health for a full-time job. You know, I'm a pest management person, but I'm not a big fan of the mixtures of, you know, 5, 6, 7 species together in one bag, because you start, you know, crops and weeds are both plants, and they eventually compete against each other. So if you get 6 different species, mix them together, you're going to have some of those plants be more competitive in the cover crop mixture, and other ones be less competitive, and you're just going to see the most competitive cover crops be successful. And so you really, I'm a fan of, you know, what's the reason for the cover crop, and then plant something for that reason. So we see, if you want to fix nitrogen, something like a vetch is great, because it fixes nitrogen. It's going to enrich the soil. If you're worried about your leaching of nitrogen, a brassica does a great job of soaking up any excess nitrogen. When you'd want to probably use a mixture is if you're planning on grazing it. But for optimizing weed control, so preventing weeds from coming up. The most competitive type of plant you can plant is going to be a winter cereal. So if weed control or to prevent erosion is your goal, you're going to want to plant something like triticale, rye, or winter wheat, and all or oats, and all those cereal crops are pretty effective at at smothering weeds and also preventing erosion. I don't know if there's a big difference between those, but you definitely want to go for cereal for weed control. But if you have different goals for cover crops, you're going to want to do something different.
Okay. Well, you mentioned brassicas a while ago, and they, that group of or that family of plants emits these chemicals that are toxic to a lot of different organisms. And so I just thought, would there be any kind of relationship there with killing or hurting weed seeds?
Yeah, there are some plants that actually do emit chemicals that can kill other plants. The brassicas, not necessarily, because you look at brassica crops and there's still weeds in that crop. It's pretty rare to be able to identify plants that do that. It's a hard thing to study, but there are some. There's some species of wiregrass that are that can inhibit germination of seedlings as weeds. It's not something you want to plant as a cover crop, but there definitely are some plants that can suppress other plants from growing through putting different chemicals in the soil.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions for Nevin, then let's I guess break into what the next one is at 10:30. Anyway, thanks everybody. Good job, Nevin.
Yeah, thank you.